In this video, I'm going to talk about the rise of the Communist Party to control China. At the end of the 19th century, heading into the 20th century, China is increasingly weak, and the imperial dynasty in China is increasingly weak. There are large parts of the country that the emperors struggle to control, that instead are ruled by local warlords who are basically independent. They have largely failed to drive out the Japanese who have seized parts of Chinese territory. They've largely failed to keep out Western and in particular British colonial enterprises that are designed to take economic advantage of China. And so there's general dissatisfaction with the ruling dynasty and a growing interest in Western ideas, a growing sense that China needs to adopt Western ideas to catch up with the West. And so we find for the first time at the beginning of the 20th century that Chinese students are leaving China to study in European universities. And they're bringing current European ideas back with them. And those ideas include nationalism and Marxism. And around 1911, there's a revolution called the Xinhai Revolution. And this revolution drives out the Chinese imperial dynasty and replaces imperial China with a republic. And at this time, the powerful figures in the republic are the nationalist party known as the Kuomintang. And they attempt to set up a Chinese republic that embraces a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment and of nationalism, but at the same time is also influenced by traditional Chinese values, which focus on, in particular, focus on loyalty to the family and focus on religion. This is an approach that's rejected by Chinese Marxists. They've worked with the nationalists to get rid of the Chinese emperors, but they don't want a society that's based on traditional Chinese values because they see these as oppressive. They see these as constructs created by the ruling class of the time in order to oppress the subservient classes. And so the Marxists break with the nationalists and a civil war breaks out. And the nationalists almost defeat the Marxists. But in the end, the Marxists are able to escape. They're able to escape from the nationalists by going on what's called the Long March through history. A long march through some of the most difficult terrain in China. And it's on this march that the leader of the Chinese Marxists, named Mao Zedong, establishes himself as a leader. And also when he eliminates a lot of the local warlords in China. And this means that when this period of civil war dies down, that China will be ready to be unified under a single government. Now, this long march through history is turned into a great propaganda victory by the Chinese Marxists, but it's still a military defeat. The nationalists still hold the upper hand. But then the Japanese intervene when they invade China again in 1936 as part of their efforts to expand their empire. It's kind of a precursor to World War II, and it's called the Second Sino-Japanese War, the second war between the Japanese and the Chinese. Once again, the Japanese are dominant early on, and they're engaging in a brutal conquest of some of the wealthiest regions of China, particularly infamous for what's known as the Rape of Nanjing. City in China that the Japanese take control of and brutally assault and massacre many of the residents for about 6 months. So it's a war crime that lasts for a very long time. And the Marxists and the nationalists in China have been fighting one another, but they realize that they are not going to be able to fight one another without the Japanese taking over the whole of China. And so they agree an alliance to fight against the Japanese invasion. In the end, of course, with help from the Americans and the Russians, they're going to be successful in defeating the Japanese. But it's during this period that the nationalists, are doing most of the fighting against the Japanese and are becoming weaker and weaker, whereas the Marxists are receiving funds from Marxist Russia, who sees the opportunity of creating an ally here, and are doing a little less of the fighting against the Japanese. And so when the war ends, the positions have kind of been reversed. when the war began, the nationalists were the more powerful party and the Marxists had almost been driven to extinction. And now the Marxists are the more powerful party, and they're able to defeat the nationalists again and again, drive them out of mainland China, to flee to Taiwan, and they declare in 1941 the People's Republic of China and will attempt to implement a communist government in China. We'll talk more about that in later videos, in later parts of the course, but this is just to set out to you how the Marxist Party and Marxism come to rule over China.